You're listening to the My Simplified Life podcast, and this is episode number 168. Welcome to the My Simplified Life podcast, a place where you will learn that your past and even your present don't define your future. Regardless of what stage of life you're in, I want you to feel inspired and encouraged to pursue your dreams, simplify your life, and start taking action today. I'm your host, Michelle Glogovac, and I'm excited to share my stories and life lessons with you while taking you on my own journey. This is My Simplified Life. Hey friends, welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Michelle Glogovac, and today I have such a great guest. We went down so many rabbit holes. It was so much fun, from talking about her new book that comes out today, Women Are The Fiercest Creatures, to talking about Real Housewives and women and empowerment and all kinds of things. It was so much fun. I am talking about Andrea Dunlop. And Andrea is a publicist from the publishing world turned author of multiple novels, and she's also a podcast host. She does all the things. She is a mom of two, one of which who is under a year old. And actually today, so I'm recording this earlier than today, but today I am meeting her in New York for her book launch, and I am so excited to get to hug her in person and meet her and to share this conversation with you, because we had just an absolute blast talking about her book and life in general and how it all intertwines. So Women Are The Fiercest Creatures, out today by Zibby Books. It's the second book from Zibby Books. And it's about three women whose lives are independent and yet intertwined because of one man. And they all have different paths. They're very different individual women, and they come together because they all have something in common, and they do so for their children. I loved the story because I kept wanting to go, what's next? What's next? And so every night I would more than happily go to bed and pick the book up so I could find out what was going on next. There's a tech aspect to it, which of course I enjoyed, being in Silicon Valley. Andrea's in Seattle, where tech is also something that's big up there. And so I also asked Andrea about how she was able to get some of the answers that she did to inform herself of the tech world and venture capitals and all of that good stuff. So I can't wait for you to hear our conversation together, and I definitely think you need to go pick up the book today. Hi, Andrea. How are you?
Hi, Michelle. I'm doing great. How are you?
I am ecstatic to talk to you. I get to
excited
fangirl on you.
Aw.
Can you take a moment to introduce yourself to everyone, please, before I just dive into why I adore you and love you now?
Oh, you're so sweet. I am Andrea Dunlop. I am the author of 4 novels, the most recent of which is Women Are The Fiercest Creatures, which comes out on March 7th of this year. I am also the host of the true crime investigative podcast, Nobody Should Believe Me. And I do some other things as well, but I won't keep us here all day. And I'm a mom of 2, which I feel like is relevant to all of my other work. So I like to mention that too.
It's definitely relevant because we have to get all this stuff done around 2 people.
Yes.
And
It's
writing
a lot,
book that's a challenge when you have little people. How old are your kids?
It is. My kids are 4 and 8 months. So we have a newish baby. So that has been, yes, all of this has been happening around him. And it's very funny because people sometimes ask me, well, do you just write while he's napping? And I sort of look at them and I say, no, I have childcare. Like this is my job. So I have to work. Like it's always funny. I think, I think sometimes being a novelist sounds like a fanciful career, which to be fair, it is a fanciful career compared to like most other jobs that you could have. But, it still does require like time and focus and all of those things. So yes, childcare is the answer. And I remember a friend of mine who's an author, Courtney Mom, told me that when I was pregnant with my first child and asking all my writer friends who I knew had kids, I was asking them for advice. And she was like, childcare, good, reliable childcare. And I was like, yeah, that's right. Cause this is our job and that's how we're going to do our job.
The problem is finding that reliable childcare.
Yes, we have, I'll go ahead and shout out my nanny, Kim, who's upstairs with the baby right now. She is so wonderful. It is very hard. Yeah, obviously we are in a massive childcare crisis in this country. So, yeah, that's like, that's easier said than done times 100. But we are fortunate, and we have family that lives close by, which is also like, I read this somewhere the other day. It's like the only true parenting hack is having grandparents that live close by. And I think that's true.
You are lucky. Yeah. I am not in that village. So luckily there's now school.
Yeah.
So let's talk first about your background, because you started in publishing. And I find it fascinating when an author is writing books and you're in the publishing world at the same time, just because it's got to be, I find it like it would have to be somewhat difficult that you're reading other people's works, you're working on your own, you got to promote theirs, promote yours. What was that all like, and how did you come into it?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I started my career in publishing, as you said, I used to be a publicist at Doubleday, which is part of Random House then, which is now Penguin Random House, because we're hopefully exiting the era of mass conglomeration. If anyone's been following publishing news, but yes, so that was, obviously like Random House. Even then, it was like the biggest publishing house in the world. It was a total dream to work there when I was 22, and yeah, it was a totally fascinating job. It was really fun. It was hard work. It was high expectations, but it was a blast. I had an amazing boss called Allison Rich, who still is at Random House. And, got to meet all of these authors. I got to meet some of these authors whose work I'd admired for years and had read all their books. And so it was really fun. It was a great way to learn about the business, as, at that point I was an aspiring author. So, my one thing about sort of my publishing work, it didn't end up crossing over that heavily with being an author myself, because I had a book that I had an agent while I was still working for Random House, but we did not sell it. And so then, I went through, like most authors, I went through all the many rounds of like, you have a book, you almost get it published, it doesn't get published, you can't, and then I had a different agent and sort of went through all these rounds of just like lots and lots and lots of rejection. I think it's a thing you can expect as a writer. I think that it's a good exercise in a lot of ways. It makes you resilient. It makes you resilient enough to actually like survive your publishing career once you're in it. So there's a lot to be said for that, going through that period of just, having a lot of doors sort of closed and then finally finding the open one. But I got my first book deal while I was still working for Girl Friday Productions in Seattle, which was my job, after I moved back to my hometown. So I was still working, I wasn't working for like a traditional publishing house, but I was still working with authors and still working on publicity and marketing stuff. And so, but then like when I left that job right around the time the book came out, and just went freelance and was doing freelance consulting. So I did quite a bit of consulting the first few years that I was working as a sort of published author as well. But, the most of my sort of publishing career sort of happened before I was sort of in the author seat, but it definitely was really helpful. I mean, I think it's been a huge benefit. It definitely didn't. I think I think I had this idea that I would like go to New York and work in book publishing, and then I would get all these connections, and then it would be really easy to get a book published. And that is not how that played out. I mean, certainly like it, none of my publishing connections actually were what led me to my eventual agent and then eventual deal. That just happened. It was someone recommended her, and she, was like someone who followed my agent, Carly Waters, who's been my agent for a long time now. A friend of mine followed her on social media and recommended her that way. So it was essentially a cold, sort of cold reach out. So yeah, I think it's kind of funny. I had this assumption where I was like, well, I'm going to meet all these fancy publishing people, and then they'll just publish my books, and that's how it will work out.
Well, being a
That was not
publicist
quite the
probably helped.
story.
It probably helped prepare you for the rejection because as a
Yeah, I
publicist,
mean,
we get rejected all the time.
yes, 100%. I mean, I think that is true. And I think just having that interior view of the business, publishing is a very, I have a very love-hate with relationship with publishing, like most authors. I think it's full of a lot of really wonderful, smart people. And it's also, a very archaic industry that is very sort of tied to this is the way we've always done things, and it's not a very inclusive industry. I mean, I think that's the biggest, broadest critique is that there has been a lot of talk about making book publishing more inclusive since 2020, when everyone collectively remembered that racism was still a problem,
Right.
when we all had that little moment. So there was a lot of talk around that time, and sort of around the American Dirt scandal and all of that stuff. But nothing really has changed if you look at the numbers. And so I think that's there's a lot to critique about publishing, and I think those critiques should continue to be made. And also, I've had amazing experiences with the people that I've worked with in publishing, both as colleagues back at Doubleday, and my editors that I've worked with, my in-house teams back with Atria, were really fabulous. And now I'm working with Zibby Books, she's really doing some very new, exciting things, and that has been a really different experience than working in traditional publishing. So I think I think that I'm hoping that these stirrings of innovation are really going to lead to a better industry, but I think that there's a lot to critique of the industry, and you can love it and critique it at the same time. And I think, in fact, if you do love it, if you do love the industry, if you do love books, if you love authors, then you should critique the industry, because we should all be pushing for it to be its best self.
Absolutely. Yeah. Have you heard of Row House Publishing?
I have, yes.
They launched
I
want to say it's a couple years ago, based on inclusivity and, promoting authors that aren't otherwise being promoted. So they're on that path as well. And Zibby, I'm a fan of Zibby. She's been on the show, and you're, the second author, the second book to come out of Zibby Books. So that's exciting. And just to see all of the press that's coming along with that too, it's absolutely incredible. It's really mind blowing, because you don't see these days books that are coming out and launching the way that Alicia's just did this last week. I mean, it was incredible.
Incredible. And I mean, Alicia's a friend, and, through this is how we met. And she, her book is so fun. It's so wonderful. I think it's going to be like a great sort of fun fantasy read. And she's just the loveliest, most bubbly person, as you've talked to her. And so I think her voice really comes through in the book. And I think, I think Zibby is really she's putting a lot of energy into the books. And they have this sort of different setup where they're publishing just one book every month. And so I think the thing that you really, that's really, really challenging about being in a big publishing house, and being on what's called the mid list, if you're familiar with that term, which just means basically you're not the lead title. So the lead title is the one that they got a 7-figure advance, and they're Prince Harry or whomever. And that's the one that's getting all of the sort of attention. And then everything else is sort of, is sort of on down from there. And so I think it can be very easy to get lost in the shuffle, right? Because there's just so many books that come out. And again, none of this is sort of a critique of any of the individual people I've worked with, because all of the people I've worked with have been really wonderful, and I've been really lucky. But I think it's just, we live in a tough attention economy, right? Books are fighting with all kinds of other forms of media and things that are taking people's attention, and it's just not easy to get people to pay attention to them. And so I think, that sort of being the only author that's coming out from that month, I think that's going to be really, really good for authors. And I think you're seeing that with Alicia's book, and Zibby certainly has done a lot of amazing things for my launch, and I'm super excited to get it out there. And it's just been fun. It's been fun to not to do just something different. I think I'm I'm a person that believes in innovation and believes that this industry could do things better. And I'm just excited to be working with a team that's like really willing to try new things, which is something that is tough. And I think part of that's just structural in publishing, right? Like, I mean, there's been so much consolidation of publishing houses over the last 20 years, and all of these like imprints that used to be their own publishing houses are now under these massive, corporate auspices. And then, even with that, it's like Penguin Random House tried to merge with Simon and Schuster, that got shut down. But it's like that consolidation. I mean, of course, that's going to lead to sort of like a more corporate take on things and more bureaucracy. And of course, that's just structurally, that's how it's going to happen. And so I will say, like, I mean, I'm still working in traditional publishing. I have a nonfiction book coming out with St. Martin's, which is, a big traditional house. And again, I'm working with my old editor, Sarah Canton there. She's wonderful. And so it's like, I'm not sort of like no to this industry, but I think, it is exciting, especially with my fiction, to try something new. I think fiction is very difficult. When I was a publicist, I worked on mostly fiction, and it's very difficult, right? It's like,
this is the second conversation today. Yeah. I had one earlier with a nonfiction author. We were chatting about her upcoming launch, and she goes, I don't know how fiction authors do it. And I don't know how you pitching them do it. And I said, yeah, it's completely different. And I mentioned that I was having you on. I go, it was a great book, but at the same time, I don't want to give it away, but I want people to read it. And yet, how do you do interviews with a fiction author? It's really talking to you, getting to know you, liking you. And then when you read the book, you can hear you in it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's other, there's some exciting things coming along. Like, I think like the effect of that TikTok is having, and that's all been, the big successes of TikTok books, the Colleen Hoovers and the Taylor Jenkins Reid and Song of Achilles and all those. I mean, those were all fiction. So I think that that's really interesting to see sort of where the influencer machine is working for fiction. And that's totally separate from like traditional media. So I think like exciting things are happening, but I'm always here for like the shifts. And I think sometimes people get very nervous, made very nervous by the shifts. But I think, I hope that things can, I think it's going to be really interesting to see where the industry is in 5 years or 10 years. It won't be where it is now. That's what we know. Things are changing.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the podcast side of it, definitely. This is something that, books aren't normally pitched on podcasts. That wasn't a norm type of thing. And I can tell by the pitches I received that it's still not a normal type of thing.
Yeah. And I think, and I'm a podcaster as well. And I think, and I do a different sort of show. It's not an interview show, but I think podcasting is like such an interesting space. It's so much newer. That's been really interesting over the past year to get into that industry and sort of having some of these assumptions that things are going to function the way that publishing does, which is just because that's the industry I know. And that's, where I've been a sort of creative person making content is in publishing. And I'm like, oh, podcasting is very different, very, very different culture, very different sort of, industry setup, different norms, different everything. So
it's
been
the
interesting
Wild
to sort of compare the two. It is the Wild West, for sure.
Yes.
And like, be sure to be armed, so to speak. Not literally, but yeah.
I guess we should talk about your book too.
Oh yeah. As we're like, it's so hard to talk about novels. So let's talk about your novel.
I love it. I love it. Women Are The Fiercest Creatures. I loved it. It's a story. Let's see if I can summarize it. And then you can tell me how off I am. But it's a story about really 3 women who have these separate lives, and yet they're all brought together by really this one man, but it's much bigger than the man. They have this connection that they're all striving for more and finding their own place, and then realize that as they come together, they're stronger together. They can feed off of each other and create something that's much bigger, beautiful. And I love that they come together at a certain point. I don't want to give it away. Because I think that in reality, when we watch like Bravo, because I'm a big fan of the Housewives, your book is completely opposite of what we see on reality TV. There's no way these women in real life would be like, kumbaya, let's all get together.
I mean, listen, I think, first of all, that is a good description. I mean, I think, yeah, it's sort of it's kind of a woman behind the man story, except that the women are, doing more than the man, as it turns out, which I think is pretty consistent with a lot of things that have happened throughout history and that happen still today. And yeah, it's the ex-wife, ex-girlfriend, and current new wife of tech CEO who's preparing to take his company public, and sort of his past comes back to haunt him, and all these three women converge. And so I think, yeah, it's funny that you said Bravo. I mean, yes, I love Bravo. I too am a Housewives fan. Although I have to say, there's not a franchise that I'm super into right now. Like Salt Lake City, I feel like the
I
first
never
two
got
seasons
into
were
it.
so good.
I watched a couple.
I love Heather Gay, but like, yeah, I'm having a little trouble. Like Beverly Hills has like gone off the rails. I don't know. I think they're having a little crisis. But I realize this is not a Housewives podcast. We could probably spend the rest
We
of the
could
time
start
talking about
one.
this.
If you want to talk about your next venture when we're done, then we could start a Housewives podcast together. Totally down with that.
But I think, the Housewives are so funny because they are like, it's become this interesting archetype of like middle-aged women. Whereas like before you just didn't have middle-aged women on television. So like on that, it's like a plus, right? It's like, well, it's nice to see women in their like 40s and 50s and sort of like nominally dealing with some of these same like parenting, marriage, like issues that, obviously it's like all to the nth degree, right? It's like a sort of, I don't know, like sort of kabuki theater like version of it. But I think too, it's really funny with, and obviously like those women, and that's the thing that sometimes just stresses me out about watching those shows, just like watching women have conflict with each other sort of stresses me out. But I think, that doesn't, it's like I think in some ways it's kind of the male fantasy of what women are like with each other more than what women are really like with each other. Because I think the women that I know, and certainly especially in this stage of life, like, being in my 40s and having, little kids and I mean, we're very reliant on each other. And if women were not able to rely on each other, like, and this is like writ large, then the world would crumble, right? Because like there's a lot of like, I have friends who are single moms. I have friends who are, it's like, not to say that like, oh, men are just all across the board unreliable, but I mean, like, I do find that most women, their number one way of coping with the stresses of motherhood is to rely on either the women in their family or their women friends. And certainly like, you're lucky if you have a really good partner. I do. I mean, my husband's wonderful, but like, yeah, I would never be able to do this gig without like the support of my female friends. And so I think actually that like I think women have been forced to be competitive with each other because of a sort of like the scarcity of opportunities that were offered to women. And so I think like certainly, especially when you talk to women of like different generations that, that didn't have as many opportunities to, especially like, I mean, this is a little bit of a tangent, but somewhat related because Anna, one of my main characters is an athlete. Like, I think that, I was born in 1982. So I'm really like part of the first generation that was post Title IX. And so we got, really the same opportunity to like compete in sports and do these kind of things that where you learn all these things about how to like work together and, like compete in a healthy way. And I sort of think there's like a huge difference between women that got to have that experience and women who didn't, because it's a really like formative experience. And so I think there's all these things that like for previous generations of women, yeah, it's like if you're only like this idea that women are sort of so competitive about men and male attention, right? Like if your only way of having a stable life for yourself was to get married, yeah, you'd probably be pretty competitive about it. Like if that was like, it was like, all right, get a good husband or that's it for you, poverty or the nunnery, I mean, like for a lot of history, that was the deal, right? And even as far back as like, even just my mother's generation and my grandmother's generation, like there wasn't like that many opportunities to be independent, right? You couldn't even have your own credit card until like 1976 or something. I can't remember what things, 76 or 78. And so, I mean, it's like, well, yeah, obviously women were competing for men because that was like about survival. And I think the less that that's become true, I think like women are less competitive with each other across the board as there's been more opportunities. But that makes sense. If you feel like, oh, this company's only going to hire one woman, then yeah, you're going to feel competitive against the other women. So I think it's like the culture has pitted women against each other. Women aren't just naturally bitchy and horrible to each other. So I think like Bravo is great and it's like fun television, but it's like you have to consume it with like a sort of knowing lens, you know? And I think that's true about a lot of media having to do with women. But I think like most women don't want to be pitted against each other. And most women like, you know, and of course, like women contain multitudes, right? Like plenty of women are assholes too. Like, I don't know if I can swear on your
You
podcast,
can.
but like,
Go ahead. You just did. You just
you know,
did.
like, I don't want to say like, I think it's also like, I'm always like wary of saying, and of course my other work, you know, speaks to this, but like women are capable of as, you know, abhorrent evil behavior as men are
Oh, sure.
when
Look at
given
our
the
government.
opportunity. Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, yeah, Marjorie Taylor Greene is out there showing us how it's done.
Don't even say her name.
You're like, you're not allowed to say, you can swear,
You can
but
say
you can't
asshole, but you can't say her name.
That particular asshole, we're not going to mention her. If we say her name 3 times, she might show up and yell at us. But yeah, I mean, no, it's like, yeah, women can be just as bad, right? Of course they can, because women are human beings and women have the full, you know, range of human behaviors. But I think like this idea that sort of women are competitive with each other in a crappy catty way, and men are just like, yeah, we're gonna play some sports and then leave it on the field. It's like, well, that's a cultural thing. So that was a very long answer, and I'm not sure what.
No, I love it. And well, you bring me to another point in the book, because we talk about this competitiveness in women, and you know, there was cheating going on, and so this mother, Anna, is, you know, being so kind to the new wife. And yet at the same time, she's like, bitch, you know, you took my husband. And so, yeah, I can see how that would create this, you know, angst and like, why you kind of ruined it. You know, takes 2 to tango. I get that. But
right.
At the same time, you're like, really? Did you really had to do that?
Well, and I think, you know, when you get into like, it's really interesting to be, again, to just like, a lot of this was like the things I think are interesting about being in midlife and like how things get so complicated, because I'm at the age now where like, you know, you go through all these waves of weddings when you're in your 30s, and then like, you know, and then you start, I think even in my 30s, you know, like start getting all the divorces. And when those divorces involve kids, it's just like, oh, this is this is so complicated. And like, then you have, it's like there's other partners and you have to put the kids first. And it's like, you have to have a relationship with your ex still. And it's like, you have to try and deal with their new partner, and you want to do it in a healthy way because it's going to affect your kids. And so I think like being a good parent gets way more complicated when you are doing it under those circumstances. And so I think I thought a lot about like, and a sort of this like thing about like, oh, the sort of idea of the other woman. Like, listen, I don't think it's a good thing to go and take someone's husband, but I don't think also husbands can be taken, I think, or wives, I think, you know, or anybody, like partners, like, you know, obviously that's like that person is more responsible for maintaining their relationship than someone who's outside of it. But yeah, I mean, I think just all of those sort of like how complicated those dynamics are, and, you know, those things are playing out all around us, right? Just in our real lives.
Every day.
I mean, it's just like a lot of drama, right? Like watching people try and negotiate sort of custody and all that stuff is like, it's gnarly.
Yeah, it's very real. And the way that children are, you know, half siblings of this and a step sibling of this, and how it continues. I mean, that's my real life. Because my husband was married before. I've got 2 stepchildren, so I've been there. I wasn't the other woman. But you know, you have to take on that role of, we do this for the children. And that's
right.
First and foremost what we have to do. And now I have 2, you know, of my own, and you still do it for the children, that you don't say negative things, because you don't want to plant that in their head. You know, someday, I always say, they'll get older. They'll be adults someday.
Yeah. And then they can make their own mind up about everyone.
Right.
But yeah. And it's just like, it's complicated enough being a parent when you're just married to your original spouse and there aren't any of those complications. And then you just throw all that stuff in there, and it's a lot.
Yeah. Let's also talk about, because it's a whole tech thing vibe with the book. And how did you research that? This is the fascinating part to me about fiction books, is you had to have done some research on what goes into, a tech media company and how he's going to go public. And how did you come to all of that? Did you do research? What was behind it? I'm fascinated because I'm in
Yeah.
Silicon Valley. So
Yeah, I mean, I did some research. Yeah, this is not just like stuff I knew about on the top of my head. I mean, my dad is a business guy. He owns a software as a service company. So some of it was talking to him. I had another friend who had a bigger tech company who went public, and so I talked to him about it, and just kind of like, yeah, to sort of get obviously you want to make these things based in the real world. And and so I think it was just like, yeah, talking to a couple of people. I mean, Seattle is lousy with tech people, so it was not hard to find a handful of people to talk to about that. So I just, I talked to some people, I did some Googling, like that kind of thing. And then I think it just like the sort of, there's a lot of real life inspiration for guys like Jake, right? I mean, I think it's been really interesting to see like some of these guys that were sort of like the tech wonderkind guys kind of coming of age, right? Like seeing how like a Mark Zuckerberg looks now versus 15 years ago, or, or a Jack Dorsey, or like some of these guys, and also like some of the older guys like Elon Musk and Steve Jobs. I thought about them a lot just in terms of like tech guys who are dropping the ball as dads.
Sure.
Which I feel like we don't talk enough about how bad of fathers Steve Jobs and Elon Musk appear to be. And like I always think about them because I'm like, oh, if a woman is a bad mother, that's it. It doesn't matter what else she does in her life. That's what she's going to be judged on. There's nothing you could ever create, invent, or do as a woman that would excuse you being a bad mother. Steve Jobs had a daughter that wrote an entire memoir about how he was a terrible father and basically let her grow up in poverty despite the fact that he was being rich. But that's not besides the fact that he was like amassing this massive fortune.
Right.
And like, that is if that's not an indictment on someone's character, I don't know what is. Is that the thing that people remember about Steve Jobs? No.
Yeah. And same for Elon. How many more kids does he have? I mean,
God, I'm like, yeah. And he's, it's always hard to know what goes on in a family, but I think that we can sort of assume that Elon Musk is like not the most stand-up dad. He
doesn't have a house. So,
and he's just like has all these children, and I heard this theory, and like, this is for entertainment purposes, so nobody sue me, but like, I heard this theory that there is some like sort of deep, like libertarian thing that, there's that people should be like the smartest people should be like repopulating the earth, and so it's a real vibe to go and father as many children as you possibly can, which that sounds creepy and like eugenics. And again, that is, Elon's a public figure, so I don't think we have to put too many caveats around that. Again, that's just hearsay, and but it sounded right to me. And I think I think like the only thing we talk about Elon Musk in the concept of like, or in the context of him being a dad, is just that like he seems to be having all these babies with different people. And he had a child that died. He had a child with his first wife that died,
right.
And obviously
from SIDS.
So sad. And so I mean, like, it's just like for someone to have that complicated of a life as a father and it not be the focus, like that would never be the case. I mean, can you imagine if there was a woman in the public eye who'd had a child die and had children with like 4 different men?
What about
like, we would talk about nothing else. We would talk
Theranos
about nothing else.
woman? Theranos?
Oh, Elizabeth Holmes.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm like,
scammer queen.
You got pregnant knowing that you're going to jail.
Yeah, 2. She had 2 whole babies.
2,
She got And I mean, I really like, I don't pretend to know what's in Elizabeth Holmes's heart. She certainly seems to be, she has done some very, very bad things. Speaking of like women proving that they can be just as bad as men. Yes, Elizabeth Holmes, thank you for that. But yeah, I mean, it sure seems like that might have been a sympathy ploy. I mean, I was thinking about, in Chicago when Roxy pretends she's pregnant, I'm like, that's the vibe. It's like she watched Chicago and was like, that's a move. I'll just get pregnant. Yeah. And I mean, the idea that like a jury would be less inclined to send a mother to jail, like she's not wrong about that. It's not, I'm not saying that's the only reason she had the baby. I sure hope not. But yeah, it's that was some choice timing. But I think she's such an interesting character because I think like what's interesting about Elizabeth Holmes is that I think we all had this feeling of like, oh no, she turned out to be a fraud. No one will ever invest in a woman ever again.
Mm.
And like, we would never think that with one of the like many, many, many men who've turned out to be frauds, right?
Daily, yeah.
Right. It's like you hear those stories daily, and yet it's just like, yes, but we're still going to like, give 98% of funding to male-led startups, and so, but it's like, if you feel like, and that's the feeling of like a woman can only mess up once, or like, it was that, I think there was a sort of a same vibe about Hillary Clinton, right? Of like, well, we can't elect the wrong woman to be the first president, or they'll never let a woman be president ever again, despite the fact that every man has been a president before this, and some of them have been very bad.
So look what we got
sort
instead.
Of this chance of like, yeah. That's speaking of whole rabbit trails we could go down. Yes, it's like let's just keep electing elderly white men. That's working out great.
Please.
Yeah, but so yeah, I mean those were kind of, so I spent a lot of time going down rabbit holes about like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, which was less for sort of like the tech stuff and more for just like the sort of like way that we venerate male entrepreneurs and forgive them anything. I mean, I feel like Steve Jobs like continues to have a pretty good reputation. And like, he was just so known for being absolutely horrible to his employees. He was horrible to his family. So it's like, if you're horrible to your employees and your family, that says everything about if you are a person in power who treats the people underneath you badly,
mm-hmm.
that says everything about you. I don't really care how cool of a phone you have. I have an iPhone. That's fine. I love my iPhone. But like, someone else could have invented that and not been terrible.
Right.
That's my argument.
You don't have to be a jackass to invent cool stuff.
No, you don't. You heard it here first.
And on next week's episode, I feel like we could have our own show.
We could. It'd be fun.
We'll have to pitch that to Zibby.
There you go. Yes.
Okay, so Women Are the Fiercest Creatures comes out March 7th. And then your podcast, I didn't even know about the podcast, and I thought I stalked you well.
Uh-oh, that means I need to like look at my my online presence if you couldn't find the podcast while it's stalking me. But yes, so my podcast is called Nobody Should Believe Me. It is an investigative true crime podcast about Munchausen by proxy. It is we had our first season come out. It's a seasonal show, so it's it's a limited series, but we're doing multiple seasons. So we're working on season 2 right now, and that should come out in May. So if you are interested in that topic at all, if you're riveted by the Gypsy Rose Blanchard saga, or Sharp Objects or The Act, or kind of these other shows that have come out, I highly recommend diving into that. It's that's sort of the work I'm doing on the other side of my life. I'm part of the Munchausen by Proxy Committee on the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. So I'm on there with a whole bunch of amazing experts that have been working on this topic for like 30 plus years. So I interviewed a bunch of them in season 1. We interviewed a bunch in season 2. And we covered a really fascinating case, the case of Hope Ybarra. I spoke to everyone in her family. I spoke to Hope for the season finale. That was really fascinating. And I also talked a bit about my own personal connection with the topic. So if that is interesting to you, then go check that out. And I always do want to say, like, yes, big trigger warning, because the whole thing is about child abuse, but we do not cover any stories in the first season where the children do not survive. So I like to say that as a mom, because like I'm not really wanting to like go and listen to something where, so it's, there are parts that are difficult to listen to, but we also took extreme pains to not make it sensationalized or gory and really focus on like the humanity of everyone involved.
I want to say I love that in a not so weird kind of way. Of like, I think that's amazing. That's incredible. I did see that you were part of the board for Munchausen by proxy. And it reminds me of, I want to say I first heard of it like when I was younger, watching 2020 on Friday nights. And, they would have those types of stories on it. And it's just fascinating because it's one of those topics that you're like, how can that happen? Like, and then as a mom, you're really like, really? WTF?
Yeah, and it is fascinating, and it's funny because people are always like, well, "I'm really excited to listen to it. Is it weird that I said that?" And I'm like, "No, it's I wanted to create something that was compelling, and I think it is compelling. It is a fascinating phenomenon, and we talked a lot about the psychopathology behind it, like what would ever make someone do this, and I think that like." Yeah, it's those things are naturally interesting. I mean, I've thought a lot. I actually am not a big true crime listener. I am a sensitive person, and I have my area where like I'm able to engage with this very dark topic because that's something that like, has affected me, and I'm able to dive into that, but I can't listen to other stuff that's about children in peril. It's interesting. It's like I only have the space for this one. But yeah, I mean, I think true crime is a really interesting genre. And when you talk about podcasting being the Wild West, I mean, true crime is the biggest segment of the podcasting world. And I think there's been a lot of much needed conversation about doing it responsibly as of late that there was not 5 years ago. And I think, yeah, it's a really like, I'm also co-writing a book with the detective who is on my podcast. We're writing about several cases. That's the book I have coming out from St. Martin's next year. And it's been a really different exercise, right? Like doing nonfiction. This is the first time I've done nonfiction, getting into true crime. I mean, you have to I feel like you have to be extremely respectful that you are talking about people's real lives and you are talking to people about the worst thing that ever happened to them. And that takes a lot of trust. And like, that's something that I really tried hard to honor. And, and I think like it's very isolating when you're going through a case or an investigation. And so I really wanted people to hear that show and feel less alone if they'd been through that. And that was and that's sort of like that's where it kind of like dovetails with my fiction. I think one of the best things that you can do whether you're writing fiction of any genre or doing podcast or whatever is just make people feel less alone. I think that's like one of the best things storytelling can do.
Absolutely. I love it. I could talk to you all day. You're fascinating. You've got so many different facets. Like we just talk about anything.
Oh, thank you. I know this has been so fun to chat with you.
I really appreciate it. Your book is fantastic. It's coming out next month, everybody. So grab it. You can get it at Zibby Books, anywhere that books are sold, your favorite indie bookstore. And where else can they find you?
Yes. And I also want to give a little plug for bookshop.org. If you are not lucky enough as I am to live in a place where there are indie bookstores everywhere, you can go on bookshop.org and those proceeds will go to indie bookstores. So that is a great online option. And yeah, I mean, I'm most active / only active on social media, on Instagram. So I'm at Andrea Dunlop, very easy to find there. My website is andreadunlop.net, and that's all the stuff about my books and podcasts are all there. So yes, I'm very findable. I love hearing from readers. I love hearing from podcast listeners. So I'm approachable. Come find me, chat me up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, friends, I don't know if you're going to go head to the couch to go watch some Real Housewives that we've inspired you, or you're going to go run out and buy the book. Just go download it. Do it now. It was such a fun read, as I said before, and Andrea is such a pleasure and a wealth of knowledge. I love that she has something to say on all of the topics that I was bringing up, and it was just so much fun to get to know the author that is behind this book that I so thoroughly enjoyed. I find that this is such an absolute treat for me to be able to read these books that I enjoy so much and then to talk to the author, the person who took the time to write this book and create these characters. It's such a gift. Anybody who's an author has this special gift, and to be able to chat with them on how they came to create such a thing is just absolutely, it's mind blowing to me. I am so lucky that this is what I get to do. So I hope you go out and grab your copy of Women Are the Fiercest Creatures. Go listen to Andrea's podcast. Go follow her. Send her a message. She will definitely say hello right back. And until next week, my friends, remember, ladies, you are the fiercest creatures.